Thanks so much for having me today. I'm just going to turn off my video so I can share my screen and kind of spend the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so talking through, I guess, my experiences, my work in youth development football specifically. But I hope what you'll find from some of the content is that actually this is way more applicable than just a youth football, coming at it from a very developmental standpoint. So I'm just gonna try and share my screen here, Sean. I might just need you to give me a heads up if that's worked okay.
Completely fine.
Lovely. Fantastic. I'll just take me off the screen there, so no one needs to see that during the presentation. So as I said, we're going to kind of take a focus today, although drawn on my experiences specifically from youth football and academy football, but very much focusing on the area of performance that can often, despite it getting more attention now than ever before, can often get lost, and can almost be neglected in many respects from a developmental standpoint. So very much focusing this webinar today on how we, within youth sport, youth football, kind of youth development environments, how we might start going about raising our awareness and understanding and knowledge and expertise around developmentally attuning our practice to the young people that we work with. And that's not me delivering here today trying to turn everybody into psychologists or push you down that avenue, but from a developmental standpoint, we all have, I guess, a duty of care to make sure how we work, the way we work in our practice is developmentally appropriate for the young people that we're working with. And one of the biggest surprises for me over the past kind of 12 years or so, which in turn actually led me to take up a PhD in this area, was the lack of developmental awareness, or the lack of support, education, attention that was given to developmentally understanding young people in youth environments, whether you were a coach, whether you were a physio, whether you were an S&C, whether you were a head of performance, whatever role you were occupying. It almost seemed like everybody had their technical expertise, if you like, but from a developmental standpoint, which ultimately across the board, whether you're coaching or performance support, surely you need to have an awareness of developmentally what's going on for these young people that we're working with. So hopefully going to give some kind of flavor on that as we go through today. Just a bit of a plan for kind of where we're going. So maybe someone can keep me on track if I start deviating, because I tend to do that. So I'm gonna start by a little bit of an intro into performance psychology in youth development football, and I guess maybe share some of my experiences and lessons over the years. Then start having a look at how we developmentally attune practice, or what considerations we should be making, which will then feed into some more specific bits, hopefully, and give you guys something to take away from today's webinar around understanding a bit around the adolescent brain, youth development, the youth development years in youth development sport. Those teenage years coincide with the developmental period of adolescence. And how much do we know about that? How much do we know about what that adolescent, what the term adolescence actually means? And then I've kind of pulled out a very pertinent area of psychological development, if you like, that's really pertinent to these adolescent age groups, which is around emotional development, which will hopefully become clear as we go through some of the slides as to why I've done that. So just to kind of kick things off then, kind of across the globe, and not just within the UK, but participation in elite sport has significantly risen and is continuing to grow. And ultimately the rise in numbers has led to global pressures for nations, for countries to want to succeed in elite sport and in youth development sports, whether that be at club level, whether that be at national level. And what that's then resulted in is actually many nations' talent development systems actually making this part of their government policies, and identifying it as almost a target, if you like. And specifically within the UK, in their 2015 government policy statement, they actually included long-term elite success and support for identification and development of talent in sport. And some of their key policy features are what I've pulled up on the screen there, and they're not too different to many other nations in terms of trying to limit the number of sports that they're specialising in. For many sports now, you know, like academy football, like tennis, like swimming, like gymnastics, looking at early specialisation. Again, you know, there's evidence for and against both sides of that. But in this policy, what was particularly interesting for me from a psychology element is that actually what they spoke about was, you know, yes, we want to increase our talent development pool. Yes, we want to be succeeding at youth level. Yes, we want to be working with grassroots all the way through to international performance. But we want to do that in such a way that protects young athletes' welfares. And what they further stipulated off the back of that was an emphasis should be placed on these youth development sport environments to consider psychosocial, psychological developmental needs of youth performers. And with that said, almost, I guess, flagging or raising awareness around the warnings that have been given in maybe previous years or you know, maybe even more recently in some sports, that mirroring adult sport at youth level is not what we're trying to achieve here. Actually, what we're trying to achieve is a developmentally appropriate environment, regardless whether we're talking about grassroots level, academy level, you know, in youth at international level performance, making sure that that environment is developmentally appropriate, developmentally tailored, because ultimately these young people that we're working with are not mini adults, and they're not mini adults because they're going through a completely different life stage. And kind of with these policies and with these you know, government statements that are released around these recommendations for sport and talent development, you know, what's important is to recognise is that, you know, within elite youth sport programs, there is considerable disparity between sports. So comparing something like academy football to gymnastics or to netball or to rugby, there's such variation between those different youth sport environments. There's, you know, the sports have different motives, agendas, aspirations, values, resource, and delivery mechanisms. They all vary significantly. With youth development football specifically, in terms of, I guess, where the majority of my experience lies within youth sport, presents a complete unique environment to kind of youth sport systems. But as I mentioned earlier, I hope for those of you that maybe aren't linked with youth sport in football or football academies, that actually some of the content that we discussed today is very applicable and transfers across nice and easily. So this is a visual that I'm sure many of you have seen before. It's a one that's used a lot, especially when kind of talking about the journey of the journey of sport to many young people, that what's reality versus what they think that their plan might be in terms of progression. And like many youth development sports settings, youth academy football can present a really hard but exclusive journey for the young aspiring players that exist within it. And within these environments, I guess my time spent both at Manchester City and and Fulham Football Club before that in the UK, where that almost the winds of change in these environments are constant. It's a place where, you know, competition is rife, it's ever present, and where sometimes fairness can be compromised for various reasons. Yet actually what these youth sport environments do present, whether we're talking about academy football or any kind of youth sport setting, is the opportunity for young players, young athletes, young performers to maybe feel that they're moving in a direction where they can progress in their sport and maybe, you know, one day live their dream of becoming that professional. The challenge for the world of football or academy football specifically is how things have kind of shifted in the last 20 years. So when on the weekend of the first Premier League season, 76% of the starting team were English, and today that figure is now dropped to 37%. So opportunities at kind of top level within the sport of football and within kind of the academy environment, the pathway to the professional level is definitely not what it was 20 years ago, for sure. Young players, you know, once not only had to be the best in this country, but they now potentially have to be some of the best in the world in order to make it to the top level of this sport. And ironically, you know, if we look at that reality picture at the bottom there, just like the physical, technical and tactical challenge that players prepare for and will face on their journeys in these different academies, you know, some of these ups and downs and these highs and lows are also related to psychological challenges. Yet one of my very early observations when I started working in these environments was, you know, we prepare players very well for the physical, technical, tactical challenges that's incorporated into training plans and training sessions and analysis sessions. Yet how much do we really prepare them to deal with the ups and downs that we see in that picture in the bottom that are related to more of the psychological side of performance? Is there the expectation there that when psychological challenges are thrown in the mix, that actually these young people just have to almost deal with them? They have to react to them in the moment. It's very rare that you see in a coaching plan an element that focuses on the psychological element and almost plans out how I'm going to try and develop that area of performance psychology, if you like I would the physical, technical or tactical areas. So with that almost stimulated my own interest into actually how can we improve the psychological awareness of those working in youth settings, and again that doesn't necessarily have to just be in sport, to make sure that actually we are holistically preparing these young people to be ready for both the opportunities and challenges that they're likely to face on their performance journeys. And I think especially over the last 5 years or so of my time spent in youth development sport, specifically within football, more so in football than any other sport, more staff than ever before seem to be acknowledging that, you know, despite the professional environment sometimes, or the perceptions that can be created around the young people that exist in these systems, you know, we're not dealing with mini adults, and there are some really important psychological developmental needs that we need to be prepared to deal with, know how to deal with, even if we're not the psychologist. Again, not all clubs, not all systems, not all sports have the provision of having psychology support in place. And I think even more importantly is to recognise that psychology is if not the most, it is one of the most integrated disciplines within sport, because at some level, each person working in those environments will be doing psychology. regardless whether they're the psychologist or not, because it's a people business, right? So you know, the coach often does way more psychology than I'll ever do with any teams that I work with, because of the level of interaction that they have with they have with young players. So that recognition that having a developmental awareness and being developmentally and psychologically attuned in your practices is really important, purely based on the fact that we're not working with mini adults, we're working with young people. We're working with young people who, during those adolescent years, are going through the second biggest developmental stage of their lives. So the first biggest developmental stage that we'll go through in our lives will be between the ages of 0 and 3. We then have a little bit of a break, and then once we enter this period of adolescence, which I'll come on to share a little bit more information about in a moment, that's then the second biggest developmental stage that we'll go through in our lifetime. And for me, those of us working with young people as they're going through that stage of development, we should have an awareness of what that is and what that means, and how you then might need to adapt and tweak and amend practices accordingly. And what that then allows us to do is almost support a positive experience during their youth development years, with providing the right help and guidance and facilitation for some of the challenges that they might face with, to ensure that we nurture and support the talent and the young people that we're working with. But I guess that said, there's definitely no hard and fast rules around how to do this. There's no handbook that says this is what will happen at this stage, because everyone will go through these developmental changes and differences that we see during adolescence at different times. And you know, I guess for me, around these opportunities and challenges of working in those youth development years, working in those youth development phases, it's afforded me, I'm very grateful for the insight it's given me and the knowledge I've built in terms of the demands of working with such an age group, of working with individuals who are going through that big developmental stage, the challenges that maybe they're faced with, but also maybe some of the misconceptions that are maybe construed by people that are more removed from those environments, especially when we're talking about academy football and in high provision clubs. And there can often be a real lack of empathy or regard for the sacrifices that young people who are in academy systems make to be in that position. I think one of the things, or one of the things that I find myself reflecting on a lot, or almost challenging people with a lot, was that it's often forgot that just like their non-academy or sport participant counterparts, you know, youth development performers, academy footballers, whoever it is that we're talking about, are going through the same grueling challenges that adolescence presents, and of growing up as everyone else, on top of having the pressures and the expectations of having to perform in their sport, having to manage the challenges, the pressures, the competitions, and at times in youth sport, what can be a very evaluative environment, even at that grassroots level. You know, when you're wanting to make that your starting team on the weekend, or you're wanting to be in this team and not that team, you know, sport by nature at any level brings pressure and expectation and competition, and we're not going to get away from that. But that adds to the challenges that already exist within these kind of youth development, adolescent years. And kind of what we, I guess, mean from a definition standpoint on this is that adolescence is almost classed as that transitional period of development, so following childhood and leading into adulthood, and it coincides with the youth development years of sport, the youth development years of football, and it's in this period, it's in this adolescence period, when young people will develop psychological, social and physical skills and start to try and figure out who they are and how they kind of fit in, how they fit into their sporting context, but also kind of how they fit into their broader world as well. And during this period of adolescence, in terms of the different changes that are taking place, there is great emphasis placed on the psychological factors that influence the development. And for some young people, we often associate adolescence with the teenage years, which would be absolutely right and fair. But for some young people, actually, the adolescent development changes that do occur, they can start as young as 8. And for others, they can go on right up until their mid-20s. So this period of adolescence actually doesn't just sit within the teenage years. For some individuals, it can start much sooner, and for other individuals, it can go on a lot longer. And I guess one of the insights that we have to try and understand this period comes from neuroscience, and comes from research that's conducted within psychology that specifically looks at kind of brain development stuff. And as I kind of mentioned before, we know that because adolescence is the second biggest developmental stage of our lives, that the teenage brain is as active as when we were 2 years old. So it's making new connections as it learns, it's engaging in new experiences, it's making lots of mistakes as it almost prunes itself, working through those adolescent years into adolescence. And when we think about it, actually, the period of time that adolescence is associated with, even if we went from 8 to mid-20s, that's still, it's still not that long. And it usually happens, or that transition into that adolescent period usually happens between the ages of 8 and 12 for most young people. And we leave childhood and we enter those early adolescent years. So I guess that's another thing to kind of identify at this point, is that when we talk about adolescence, it's often used as a bit of a generic term, or they're an adolescent, he's a teenager. But actually, for those of us, especially those of us working in performance environments with adolescents, it's a little bit more specific than that. So adolescence can be broken down into 3 key kind of sub-stages, if you like. Early adolescence, which is kind of, that first stage from usually about 10 to 13 years. So you're kind of, from an academy football perspective, you're maybe just leaving the foundation phase and you're entering those youth development years. Then we have mid-adolescence. So mid-adolescence being between the ages of 14 and 17. So again, that's probably in kind of leading up to, from a football academy perspective, leading up to entering kind of under 18 age groups in the professional development stage. And then ironically, they're still in adolescence when they're in really professional development stage of under 18s and under 23s. And for some young players who are excelling in their performances, they could even be in a first team environment, even though they're still in that final stage, that late stage of adolescence, which exists usually between 18 and 21 years. But for some, it can go right up into the mid-20s in terms of the developmental state, the developmental changes that are still happening. But again, what we know from the neuroscience research is that more specifically, the bracket or the age range between 11 and 16 years specifically has been identified as a time of increased vulnerability, and the period where the most profound changes happen physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. And again, that's not a massive period of time, but it's smack bang in the middle of those youth development years when it comes to sport. The challenge for, I guess, us as staff working with those young people during this phase of development is that their brains are wired to be impatient and impulsive. And again, I'll come on to share a little bit more information about that in a moment. But what we know is the teenage brain, or the adolescent brain, tends to be quite highly sensitive to reward. There will be some high sensitivity to threat there as well, in terms of things going wrong, making mistakes, worrying about things, absolutely. But in terms of how we're wired, what is, as humans, none of us want to fail. We want to achieve, but as a young person, they're really sensitive to rewards that can be gained. And again, that can create some challenges for us as staff working with and supporting them. And again, just kind of tapping back into this neuroscience bit, is that the reason we know some of these things comes from neuroimaging research, some of which I'm gonna talk about in a short while. But very, very basically, if we think of if we split our brain into two systems, an emotional system, so kind of system one, if you like, and a thinking system, system two. Really, really basic level, but what we know from an adolescent perspective is between the emotional part of our brain and the thinking part of our brain, there's less synchronization between those two systems during adolescence compared to us as adults. Those two systems, if you like, the emotional system and the thinking system, are maturing at different rates. So for those of you who are interested in kind of this area of things, and maybe have done some reading and research, or have some expertise in this area yourselves, so we're talking about the amygdala, which is the scientific terminology for that emotional part of the brain. It's very, very small, but it's very, very powerful. The emotional part of the brain is predicted to be almost 5 times more powerful than the logical, rational, thinking part of the brain, which is also termed, from a scientific point, the cortex. So the cortex is much bigger, but can be very easily overpowered by our emotional brain because it's very powerful. As adults, we have better control in almost managing those two systems, but adolescents are almost still going through such changes that they're not able to do that as well. So I mentioned kind of system one, the emotional brain, system two, the thinking brain. So our system one, the emotional brain, tends to be quite irrational, quite reactive, can be quite judgmental, and it's very fast paced. Whereas the thinking brain, system two, or cortex, tends to be much more logical, much more rational, much more considered in terms of its decision making, and much slower to respond to things. And it's important to recognize that during adolescence, this system one, the socio-emotional system, if you like, or the emotional part of our brain, is far more responsive compared to adults and younger stages of life. And the developmental, almost the developmental course, or the developmental trajectory that the emotional part of the brain takes, is also closely tied to the onset of puberty. And puberty is an important developmental process to recognize when we're working with young people, given that it's during this period that, pubertal hormones will trigger a series of structural and functional changes in the brain. And that comes back to that link to the sensitivity that adolescents often have with reward. So it's because of their levels of hormones and the different triggers that those hormones relate to, and the different changes that are occurring. So this onset of puberty can almost increase the activation even more, if you like, of that emotional, that system one, that emotional part of the brain, and cause it to be hypersensitive. Almost on hyper alert, if you like, which is why we can often see adolescents have kind of extreme emotional outbursts or mood swings, or fly off the handle when something happens, because not only are they going through that developmental period of adolescence, they're also going through puberty. There's an influx of those different hormones there. Those hormones combined with all of those different changes lead that system one, that emotional part of the brain, to become much more sensitive. But in situations where there's minimal activation of that emotional system, in situations or environments where actually the emotion is relatively low, then actually the decision making of adolescents can be just as good as adults. But when adolescents are put in a situation whereby emotions are heightened, and that system 1 is activated and aroused, if you like, then adolescents' decision making is definitely less rational, definitely less considered, definitely much more illogical, because it's driven by that it's very much driven by that emotional system, which is, we know, is much more powerful than the system 2. So without wanting to go into too much detail, I hope that's given you a bit of a feel for kind of some kind of science that sits behind what's going on in a developmental standpoint when we're working with these young people. And again, just kind of flicking back to my own experiences, I was definitely regularly presented during my time working in academy football and youth sport with the observation that the maturity of the mind definitely does not always match the maturity of the feet or the body. Some players, so again, this term will be familiar to most, early developers can often demonstrate advanced physical markers when it comes to performance or technical, exceptional technical abilities, yet they don't necessarily show the same advancements cognitively or socially or emotionally. And in some cases where players are very physically advanced or technically gifted, they can then really struggle with the psychological aspects of performance, because there's been maybe an over-reliance on kind of other areas of performance. And I think this contributes to what has been historically an oversight in especially academy football programs, given that I guess the tradition has been to have that greater focus on the physical, technical and tactical aspects of the game. And the psychological aspects, as I alluded to earlier, you know, definitely didn't come across to me as affording the same conscious time, effort and integration as the physical, technical and tactical elements of the programme. Yet within English football specifically, you know, a holistic approach that covers all aspects of player development has been recommended since as far back as 2002. One of the things that I could definitely recommend if anyone is really interested in this area and reading a little bit further after this webinar, is Sarah Jane Blakemore's book, Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain. And although it's not specific to youth development football or youth development sport for that matter, what it has done is complemented the importance of the psychological considerations when working with young people in their teenage years. And the book has been written by Blakemore, who has developed and dedicated much of her career to advancing the understanding that exists within the field of adolescent development and teenage brain. And what this book does really well is captures the complexity of this period of adolescence in a really simple, easy to understand way, busting some of the myths and challenging some of the considerations of important developmental occurrences during teenage years. And for those working with young people, it delivers the message of recognizing that these adolescents, these teenagers, these youth performers are going through a fundamental developmental life transition, which is so fitting for the work that those of us do within youth development sports systems, because it highlights the complex interplay between the young person's environment and their brain development. And what Sarah Jane does really well is explains the sensitivity and the vulnerability that the period of adolescence actually presents, and the importance of all of us who are working with young people having an awareness and understanding of developmentally what is going on during this stage of life. She highlighted really well in one of the chapters that adolescent behavior is not just mindless or destructive behaviors by young people, although at times to us it can maybe feel like that, but that it happens for a reason due to what the brain is undergoing in terms of its development, which in turn then contributes to the trials and tribulations that we often see and that present themselves to us in terms of adolescent behaviours. And I guess, as I mentioned before, you know, these young people who are in youth development support systems are not only going through the same challenges as their non-youth sport performers, but on top of some of the other challenges that the other challenges that are presented from just being part of a sporting environment. And it really highlighted to me that it seems that the more informed and knowledgeable that we can be around pertinent psychological considerations when working with young people can lead to much more positive performances for them and for us, but can also lead to much better personal development as well. So kind of having an awareness of these key developmental stages, although we're applying them in a performance setting or in a sports setting, is hopefully going to add real quality to kind of other areas of their life as well, which is then what takes us, I guess, to this focus of emotions specifically. And those of you that haven't seen the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out, again, on top of Sarah Jane Blakemore's book, would be another recommendation off the back of this webinar, and something that I've used a lot in my applied practice with young people to talk about emotions. But the important thing to recognize here is that every young person's emotional development is different. You know, we don't know what's going on internally. We can't see that brain development happening. But what we do know is that these emotional development experiences are shaped by their own unique experiences, their combinations of genes, the stage of development that their brain's at, environmental experiences, social experiences with family, friends, community and culture. So there's lots kind of going on here. But what we can be almost sure about is that compared to us as adults, adolescents will differ in their emotional responses. They'll differ in terms of the frequency of emotions that they'll be experiencing. Adolescents will experience a range of different emotions on a daily basis, and they'll experience new combinations of emotions, and those emotional highs and lows will happen much more frequently during this adolescent period, and also their expression of those emotions will also be different. So if they're experiencing an emotion for the first time, they're not really sure what that is, especially if it's a combination of a few different emotions, and it becomes much more complex. So their expression or their outward presentation of that emotion, again, is not always as maybe favourable as they or we would like. And their not only their sensitivity to, but their understanding of their emotions can also be quite vast and can vary quite considerably. You know, how we might see them present themselves when they have really positive emotions compared to how we might see them present themselves when they have much more unpleasant emotions could be slightly differently. But also one of the big challenges is their ability to be able to control and channel maybe some of those more unpleasant emotions. Again, simply because of the stage of development, they're still learning the strategies and techniques that are going to be effective in helping them do that, essentially. But for us, the thing to note here around developmentally attuning our practice and working, you know, acknowledging that the emotional part of that, the brain is very much active and very much hypersensitive during this stage of development, is that actually being able to regulate the emotions that you have as a young person is a developmental achievement. It's something that must be learnt. So in performance environments, and again, I'm not talking about just the top level, but at any level that we're looking for a performance output, this shouldn't therefore be something that we just expect them to be able to do. It's something that we should be investing conscious effort and conscious attention in to almost prepare them and facilitate those emotional experiences that we know they're going to have. And how we do that, almost if we want to help young people get better at regulating their emotions and managing that emotional part of the brain that we know is going to be very, very active and very sensitive, then what we need to achieve first and foremost before we get to that point is better levels of emotional awareness. And better levels of emotional awareness comes from our ability to communicate, to talk about feelings and maybe the softer side of performance. And that's not, again, from my own experiences and observations, that's not something that was necessarily readily done in kind of the football environment. But as young people, you know, not every young person is going to struggle managing their emotions, but they're going to have the potential to be really challenged by this area of development. And as young people develop their emotional regulation skills, and as they progress through these adolescent years, in early adolescence, mid-adolescence, late adolescence, they become much better at it. They develop the capacity to separate their internal emotions from their external expressions, so that they almost learn to manage them much better. And they also, I guess, can manage the upheaval of this emotional system much more efficiently and effectively. But ultimately, that in the early stages, we have to almost anticipate or expect them to get that wrong. They have to learn the strategies that work for them, and for each individual, those are all going to be different. But also, what determines how quickly emotional control or emotional regulation skills are learned are kind of these three areas. You know, their own individual nervous system that provides the necessary neurological hardware, if you like, that's required for eventual regulation of emotions, and their individual temperament and development status. So where they're at in terms of the psychological areas of development, emotionally, socially, cognitively, that's not necessarily something we can see. But also their temperament as individuals. You know, some individuals are much more vulnerable to emotional dysregulation than others. Those that maybe have learning difficulties, attentional deficits, or just different levels of temperament generally, you know, might find this area of development a lot harder than others. And then finally, you know, what you mentioned earlier, their socialization and environmental support or exposures that they have, you know, different families and different cultures and different people, you know, us being some people that they're involved with, are going to talk about emotions in different ways. Some of us are going to be much more comfortable talking about and being vulnerable about feelings compared to any other people, again, based on our own experiences. So we know that, you know, the likelihood is that we're going to during this period of adolescence, we're likely going to see strong and intense emotions. We're going to see ups and downs. And those ups and downs have the potential to lead to conflict between us and them, because we can get frustrated. We can think, why is he acting like that? Why is she behaving like that? Why is she getting wound up by that? And almost part of our job is to not get sucked into their emotional roller coaster and almost be at that high level of emotion with them, which can just cause clashes. And remembering as well that because they're going through this second, you know, all of these developmental changes, and there's lots of brain development going on, these adolescent years are a prime time for learning. They're very, their brain flex, their malleability, if you like, the plasticity of their brains are super sensitive. So therefore they'll be affected by the emotions that you feel. So just having an awareness that actually, if you're not controlling or regulating your emotions very well, the likelihood of the young people that you're working with to be able to do that gets reduced. Remember that they are trying. As you know, we've all been there. We've all been a teenager. We've all been an adolescent. We've all been in that point of our lives where we think nobody understands, nobody gets it. But also that we know that we're not a kid anymore. We know that we're not a child, and we want to be an adult. but we don't want to accept that we're not quite yet an adult. So they are trying to control and express their emotions in a grown-up way. But quite often they're going to get things wrong, for sure. So in terms of how, I guess, we can help then, and just, again, keeping it very simple and happy for any questions to come around any of this stuff that I've talked about so far. But being able to regulate our emotions, it comes from our ability to manage the working part of our memory, our ability to be able to focus and block out distractions, our ability to be able to think outside the box, kind of see those areas of grey, think more abstractly, and not just view things as black or white, but to see the grey areas that sit in between, to be able to engage in good decision making, to be able to perspective take, so to be able to kind of step outside of the emotion and see the situation from a different angle. All of those things are really important to enable good emotional regulation. And ironically, all undergo development during adolescence, but we need them all in order to effectively regulate. And just a very simple, I guess, strategy that I've used over the years when I've been working with coaches and other support staff is the importance of us as staff to first of all recognize the emotion, recognize the emotional triggers, recognize the empathize with that. Everyone's behavior makes sense to them at some level. Now, what we're not saying here is feeling sorry for young people when they're experiencing certain emotions, even if they are unpleasant, but just seeking to understand, even if you don't understand, but having the attitude of, well, I don't know why, I don't know why you're getting upset about that for, what you're getting stressed about that for, or whatever it might be. Remembering that the emotion that any of us experience, but the emotion that young person experiences is real to them. Whether you think it's right or wrong that they're experiencing that emotion, trying to display a degree of empathy will massively facilitate the process of them being able to regulate their emotions just a lot better, not feeling judged. In terms of because sometimes they won't even know why they're feeling the way that they're feeling. So having that degree of empathy is really important, and then normalizing it. As human beings, that's the one thing we all have in common. We all feel, and if we can normalize that, sometimes we do get really stressed, and sometimes we do get really frustrated and angry, or sometimes we do get overly excited. Whatever the emotion might be, acknowledging that emotional experiences are really normal. And almost having a sense of vulnerability to be able to share maybe your own experiences of those types of emotions that you see kind of presenting themselves for young people. And I think it's not to forget as well that young people aren't deliberately, adolescents aren't deliberately just trying to be difficult, although sometimes maybe that's debatable. But they, around this regulating of emotions and this emotional development piece, when working in sport, young people are probably definitely trying, but they could definitely do better with your help, and almost actively providing validation for their perspective, actively providing validation for their responses and emotions, and almost allowing them to have a response to situations, and seeking to understand that response, seeking to understand their perspective on the situation. As adults, we are much better, or should be much better, at taking perspective than an adolescent is. So we need to really hone and use that skill. And again, I know I've already mentioned this, but remembering that there is some inherent validity in every response. Everyone's behavior makes sense to them at some level. So when they are flying off the handle, when they are getting frustrated, when maybe they are getting overly excited, for them, that behavior makes total sense in that situation. They maybe just haven't figured out yet, actually, it's not completely not acceptable, but appropriate. And then finally, from our perspective as staff working with these young people, almost helping young people avoid avoiding, because we know when, especially around the unpleasant emotions, if we continue to avoid those those unpleasant negative emotional experiences, and we push them down, we bottle. We can only bottle for so long before we then go bang. So we almost want to avoid the suppression of emotions in young people and create an environment whereby actually we do talk about how we're feeling. We do talk about emotional challenges. We do deliberately try to trigger certain emotions in training so that when you do experience them, and again, you feel much more prepared and equipped for them. It's definitely going to be an emotional roller coaster working with adolescents around this area of emotion. I can speak from experience. But some things that are quite interesting is that the average emotional state over a general week for a young person, for an adolescent, for a teenager, tends to be more negative in the early to mid-adolescent years. So their emotional state tends to be more negative when they're in those early to mid-adolescent periods. But the stability of emotional states increase with age. And interestingly, we have around 50 to 70,000 thoughts per day. We're not consciously aware of all those thoughts, but that's roughly how many thoughts go through each of our minds per day. And approximately 70% of these are negative, and 95 to 98% are quite repetitive. And that can be much higher in young people. We've definitely not evolved as humans to feel happy and content. So those emotional states naturally can be quite negative. We know young people are less effective at regulating their own emotions. They're definitely going to be affected by their emotional context, so their peers, when making decisions. They're not going to have access to the same range of strategies that we do, because maybe they're not aware of certain strategies that they can use to control their emotions. They haven't had enough practice with them. And some strategies around emotional regulation are simply too complex for adolescents, and they haven't yet developed, because of the lag that exists between the emotional part and the thinking part of their brain. They don't yet have the skill set to be able to employ some of those more thinking-based strategies. And likewise, when one strategy isn't working, adolescents don't have as good of an ability as adults to be able to switch from one strategy to another if the first one proves ineffective. Again, because the thinking processes, the connections between the emotional part and the thinking part of the brain are still very much developing. So just to kind of finish off then, and before, I'm more than happy to take any questions or get anyone's thoughts on the topic of today. Emotion provides us with important information about ourselves, our players, and the environment. Channeling emotions and strategies that are involved in emotional regulation are individual, are unique, but also being able to employ these strategies is a developmental achievement. It's something that is learned the same way physical, technical, and tactical skills are learned. So how much are you incorporating that sort of learning into your practice and accommodating for the developmental stage that these young people are at? Although they don't like to admit it, they often do need our help when it comes to this emotional development stuff. We might need to lend them our cortex or our logical, rational thinking brain at times. We might need to be the logical, rational one, because they're not at that stage yet where they can do that very well. And actually being patient with this area of development, and not passive, not completely dismissing it is really important. The empathy and the normalization of it, again, is something that I'd very much advise, and avoiding. If we want to get better emotional regulation, we need better emotional awareness first. How do we get emotional awareness? Well, we get that by talking much more open and being much more open to discussing emotions. And that is the end of my presentation today. And I would very much welcome any questions that anyone has, or any comments on any of that, really. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Philippa. That was great stuff. We have got question coming in, and if you've got any more, guys, please add them into the Q&A. I've got a couple as well as we go through this process. Noel has asked, first he said, great presentation, and then he said, how can I incorporate a psychosocial theme or themes into my practices? What would that look like, and could you kind of give an example for when you're planning around sessions or activities for players?
Yeah, so I think this is where really like you try and like any area of coaching and of performance, you kind of try and take this the tacit knowledge, if you like, of this content that we've gone through today, and think, okay, how do I craft that into something? And just I guess to give one example would be if we're looking to help players maybe manage emotional challenges or high levels of emotion, maybe in training we need to design practices that are going to trigger or stimulate some of those emotional experiences, and we need to maybe design practices whereby those emotions that maybe do present them, and you can never truly replicate a competition or a match day. We know that's really difficult, but if we can design practices and processes that are really going to ramp up the level of challenge, that are really going to almost arouse players in that in that practice and in that activity, then it's almost the demonstration and the demonstration of and the conversation that comes off the back of, how did everyone feel during that? Especially if levels of failure, you've designed the practice so levels of failure are really high, that can be really frustrating. If you've not made teams, even if you're not making fair decisions, they're all deliberate. And I think people will be like, oh, you got to be careful doing that in a practice. Absolutely. But the most important thing when you're evoking high levels of emotion, or you're creating a practice whereby actually we're trying to recreate some of the emotions that I know that on a game day you guys find really challenging, and actually I know that when you experience them I start to see a dip in performance. If we can try and recreate some practices that maybe evoke some of those emotions in training, but then have a debrief after it. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how it felt. Let's talk about what it did to you. Let's raise awareness of, when I feel this is what I do. When I feel that emotion, this is how I tend to behave. And almost off the back of those conversations, that then leads into, okay, you've got that awareness now that when you feel this emotion, this is the general, this is the behavior that we see. And that behavior or that response isn't great. How can we start and try and change that behavior? So again, that's another important point, that actually when we're learning how to regulate emotions, can we make it behavioral? Can we make it whereby we're not trying to change the emotion, we're not trying to meddle with the feeling. I don't even go there because it's so hard to try and change a feeling. What you can do though is change the behavior. Changing the behavior is much more controllable than trying to change the emotion. And if you can get to that point of raising the awareness, having the conversation, and then implementing some sort of behavior change, that can be really powerful. I hope that maybe gives a little bit of insight or some food for thought in relation to that question, Sean.
Is that something that is very kind of, I guess, difficult and a challenge to manage as a coach from a group dynamic, because you have so many different players who react in so many different ways. There's so many different situations, stimuli. So do you have to, I guess, before even this starts this process of developing that, do you have to really go into the process of knowing your players, knowing how and when they respond to certain reasons?
Yeah, for sure. And we've in the past, I've done a fair bit of work around identifying individual emotional triggers. So I'm sure everyone's heard of or maybe aware of the red head, blue head strategy that was employed by the All Blacks around identifying what's my red head triggers, so almost my unpleasant emotional triggers that when those things happen, I know I'm not going to get a good performance. And spending some time with individual players, identifying what that is and what that looks like. So you as the coach, or you as the member of the performance team, know what you're looking out for in individual players, and almost having those as a resource in player folders or whatever you have. And then also identifying, the blue head. Where am I when I'm at my best? What does my blue head look like? What am I feeling? What does that look like? How is that different? And also what things trigger that red head? because the important, young players will often say bad refereeing decisions, not making the starting lineup, when I'm played out of position, when my teammates don't do what I ask. And I've regularly challenged that and said, I can tell you now, we're not going to change any of that. Referees are going to make bad decisions. You're not always going to make the starting lineup. You're going to be substituted. You're not going to always get the ball when you want it. You're not going to always play in your preferred position. We can't change those things. What we can change is how you respond to those situations and how you manage the way that you feel in those situations a lot better based on how you act, your behaviors. But absolutely trying to dedicate some time, and I know that's really difficult, for time, to understanding players, understanding what their emotional triggers are, what redhead, blue heads look like. And I'm not saying a whole coaching practice would be dedicated around managing emotions, but there might be a bit at the end, or a bit at the beginning, or a bit in the middle, where you might just incorporate that into a session. It would be far too draining to have a whole session on managing emotions, but it might just be incorporated for a short period of time at certain points.
If you were looking at that, I guess, from a longer term planning process, kind of development plan for a player that incorporates those, I guess, awarenesses. And so you can start, when you're done designing a practice, you're designing a practice that specifically has developmental goals and targets for the player around technical, tactical, but also around that emotional and mental skill development, to kind of put one player in a position where he's 2v1. You know that he's being challenged overly. So you put him in those situations, again, not to over challenge him and to damage his confidence, but to help him understand his behaviours. And again, instead of filtering it into one session, you filter it across a whole season by helping him identify that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in all honesty, Sean, I do firmly believe, as unrealistic as it may sound, that this area of performance is something that really could be periodized across the whole of the youth development phase, if you like, in terms of almost the, you can do much more intense things with maybe a 16, 17-year-old than you can with a 12, 13-year-old. So again, that, and there's so much more stuff that I could have put in today's presentation that it would have just actually probably killed everybody off if I'd gone on talking any longer. But even that deeper understanding of, okay, if I'm a coach who's working in the early adolescent years, what are some of the key developmental considerations that I need to know about that? And there's information out there on that. If I'm working in mid-adolescence between 14 to 17, what are some of the developmental considerations that I need to make? So again, you can start tailoring your practice around those kind of subsections of the adolescent period as well. But I think also, just to jump on your point around individual development plans, remember, not every adolescent is going to be challenged or find managing their emotions really difficult. Some of them are going to absolutely sail through this period of development around emotional management and be very good at it, be very able and capable of expressing and discussing their emotions, be just really, naturally you get some players who are gifted technically, tactically, physically. You also naturally get some players who are gifted who just get the psychological side and who manage the emotions just much better. Again, how can you use those players to almost role model to other players as well? And just, I guess, from an individual development plan perspective, not assuming that every single adolescent that you work with is going to have a challenge with this area of development, because they're not. But we're just saying they're much more susceptible to, because of the stage of development that they're going through and because of what we know is going to be happening at a neurological standpoint.
If you're looking at that from a periodization standpoint, as you mentioned, obviously the periods of adolescence and development, just as we go through different cycles of just growing up, I guess. But is there any point in which you would say it's not appropriate to introduce this, even from a touch point standpoint, to a 8, 9, 10-year-old, because they're just not ready for it? Or is it okay to kind of put the idea in, but not explore it too greatly, so as it becomes a light bulb moment a little bit more clearly when they reach that point of understanding?
It's really interesting, because when they tend to hit those individuals that maybe are going to struggle with the emotional side of development, when they hit adolescence, and I've had this conversation so many times with coaches, it's like, he's worse now at 13 than he was when he was 9. He was better at managing his emotions when he was 9 than he is when he was 13, because puberty, hormones, all of that, they didn't have that when he was 9. But you're absolutely right in terms of kind of planting the seed, in terms of getting young players used to talk and getting young players comfortable kind of talk. How did that feel? Like anyone else feel get a bit angry when that happened in today's game, or anyone else feel frustrated in the training session, or anyone else get a bit too excited? And having those sorts of again, developmentally appropriate conversations, but where we're trying to integrate that, not necessarily emotional regulation stuff, but the emotional awareness stuff nice and early. We're creating an environment where we talk about this stuff as easily and as readily as we'd talk about your speed, your agility, your technique, your 1v1s, your defending. You know, we incorporate this psychological element of performance nice and early.
We had Dan Abrams on, one of our first presenters, and obviously his whole model is around building that psychosocial framework, and everything kind of filters into that. Is that how you feel that this emotional management and performance element, kind of everything kind of stems from this foundation, this base, because it informs the ability to engage with the process of, really perform at those high levels, because it's so dictated and driven by the emotional responses and behaviors?
Well, we are, as humans, we are emotional beings. You, like, as much as people say, like, as much as people could argue that I don't feel, like, yes, everyone feels. We all feel because we're human. And I think I mentioned it in the presentation, like, that's the connection that you have with these young people. Like, you will feel similar emotions to they do at times, and we can't get away from that. But I guess, yeah, that point of what you're not trying to do with these young people is meddle or suppress the emotional experiences. They have to experience those unpleasant emotions just as much as they should experience the pleasant ones, when they're feeling confident, when they're thriving, they're excited, they're happy. But they also have to experience the frustration and the disappointment, and because that's really important for development as well. Protecting them from those negative, unpleasant emotions, and never having, not talking about them, not discussing about them, never wanting them to experience those, isn't going to be helpful for their, not just their development as a young performer, their development as a person. So in terms of it, almost, you can't get away from it. So I almost do absolutely agree. Like, it's almost a foundation piece of work that actually, if you can incorporate that into your practice, and actually if the first step of that is just you as a practitioner, as a coach, as a member of the performance team, just raising your awareness of what this stuff is, and actually the age groups that I'm working with from a developmental standpoint, what do I need to know? And it's not about being the psychologist or having any expert level of experience, but it's just not like, what are the key things, what are the key developmental points that are going to be really useful for me as a coach working with this group of 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 10-year-olds. And like I say, I probably could have done another presentation just on kind of highlighting some of those areas, but time got the better of us today.
Next time. Stephen has asked, if you're in a more recreational environment, how would you go about implementing this culture to parents, coaches and players that maybe not as committed to the development or to competition, if that makes sense? Yeah,
so I think you can almost, again, from an adolescent perspective, like, remove the level of performance that they're at, because from a development perspective, we know that they're going to go through these profound changes during these years. In terms of how you do that, where maybe the level of competition or pressure or expectation isn't as much, doesn't mean that those young people aren't going to feel. And this is where, actually, from just a positive psychological development standpoint, not necessarily just as not looking at the young people that you're working with just as footballers or performers or gymnasts or tennis players, but actually the person, actually what can I do as this person who has the privilege of working with this young person during the second biggest developmental stage of their life? Like, what can I do from an emotional standpoint to equip him, even if it's not going off to play in an academy or play for the national team. How am I accounting for incorporating some of this stuff that I now know about developmentally attuned and practice and working with young people? Because, you know, even at recreational level, I'm in a grassroots level, you know, we're gonna see different emotions in players. Just, you know, the emotion doesn't necessarily just come from increased pressure and increased competition and high level of performance. They might have just had a bad day at school. They might come off a really, really terrible day at school and then into your session, and then you're like, what the hell's going on? Like, he's not usually like this, or she doesn't usually respond like that. So again, I'd almost bring it back to how much you incorporate emotional based conversations into debriefs, team talks, whether that be before training, whether that be before or after a game. In parent meetings, how can you incorporate some of this stuff, some of this knowledge that you might have around adolescent development into parent meetings, even if it's at, you know, the beginning of the season, and it's like kind of welcome to the team, like we've got, you know, we're really excited to have everyone on board. One thing to remember, we've got a group of 13-year-olds that we're dealing with here. We're going to see some highs and lows. We know this because we know that they're going through the second biggest developmental phase of their life. What we are going to try and do during this year is try and help them get better at maybe managing some of those highs and lows that they're likely to experience. Maybe not even in relation to what's going on the pitch, but what's going on at school that day. I'm sure you're going to get a very different side of them at home. And just trying to incorporate that level of awareness and that, and almost that openness around your communications of talking about this area of development and performance. It's not development or, you know, this part of you know, what we're talking about here goes across person and player.
There's been, I guess, a lot of work and some studies recently in terms of the development of resilience, development of grit, and some people seeing it as being a difference maker between kids who are able to compete at the very highest level and kids who don't quite make it. Does that tie into this emotional management and providing the appropriate challenges to help develop those behaviours that when they take hits, when they take disappointments, that they're able to I guess get back on the horse, as it were?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, we try in psychology to compartmentalize all the different areas. So if you're talking about motivation or resilience or confidence, then that's what we're talking about. The reality is there's so much crossover, and it's not as clean cut is that at all. And I know from my own experiences of even thinking about some players that I'm current athletes who I'm currently working with now, you know, one might be working on kind of certain areas of the performance, but there's a massive crossover with other areas as well. So absolutely something like, you know, working on or trying to develop emotional awareness to feed into better emotional regulation. Is that going to, from a coping standpoint, by having better emotional awareness and being able to regulate your emotions a bit better, is that going to help you deal with situations where you're faced with adversity or setback or you know, life events that might be really, really challenging? Absolutely. Could it just provide you with, like we talked about earlier, almost that foundation, that safety net, if you like? It from a resilience standpoint, I probably almost see it as a coping strategy. Something that can facilitate those tough times, but equally, if you've got good emotional awareness and good regulation skills, you know, resilience isn't just about response to setbacks, it's also about your response to success as well. So how you're able to manage almost both sides of that coin, I think it could form a good foundation for.
One last question for you, and this is, I guess, from a coach's perspective. We often say coaches need to, and you mentioned in the presentation, need to have a really good emotional control because the players feed off their emotions. So a lot of coaches do tend to struggle with that part from my personal experience and from seeing other coaches in terms of just emotional intelligence and just controlling their emotions both in training and at games. What would be, I guess, the best advice you could give a coach who wants to develop, I guess, strategies for that part from themselves, so they can then filter it into their players?
Great question, and a tough question. Because I think, going back to our point that we all have emotions, and especially as the coach, you're emotionally involved, aren't you? Like, you sometimes want it more than the players want it. I think almost doing a bit of similar to what we talked about before. Like, do you know what your emotional triggers are? Like, do you know when you're on the side of that pitch, or when you're in that training session, what are some of the triggers that are going to push your red head buttons? And by having an awareness of, I know that's a trigger, almost puts you on the forefront of being in a better position to be able to manage that. And also being really honest of, again, this is a term that's kind of been used in some of the research and articles, but like, what's gonna hijack your emotional brain? What's gonna, that amygdala hijack? Knowing what your hijacks are, and then almost having a plan for, right, well, what am I going to do? And again, not trying to control the emotion, because in all honesty, you are going to lose that battle, even if you're an adult and have got all the, the best strategies in the world in your toolbox. But actually, if you can focus your attention on your actions and your behavior and what is overtly being demonstrated to the rest of the world, if you like, and almost identify, like, actually, these are the behaviors. This is the way that I need to be behaving when I'm on the sideline, when I'm in a training session. This is how I need to manage my communications. This is how I need to manage my feedback. And, doing things like, if you work with an assistant coach, or kind of seeking some feedback and almost some peer support for that. If you're fortunate enough to have access to an analyst, where you can like link yourself up and you can record yourself, or you can watch your behavior, those sorts of things, where you're just trying to be a bit more proactive of, if I know that I do get emotionally more involved, one, let's identify what's going to trigger those emotions off, and two, let's start identifying the controllables, which is, what are the behaviors that I'm doing that I know are not conducive to me or my players, and how, because behavior at every level is controllable, we'll have a choice of how we behave, that becomes a much more realistic strategy than trying to say, okay, I'm just going to try and stop feeling that way. You're not going to do that.
Well, Philippa, thank you so much for taking the time today. Presentation was great, and answering the questions as well. And thank you everyone who joined us as well. And Philippa, one last time, thank you for today. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sean. Thanks, everyone.